So, hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining this session. This session is on the other global diaspora and contemporary Zionism, communities outside North America. So the logic of the Z3 applies not just to Israel and the US, but also to other communities such as in England, France, Mexico, or Australia, and dozens of other locations around the world. This session will explore the relevance of Z3 thinking to these communities. So we have here a distinguished panel of speakers representing different communities around the world. We have Lisa Antillon, who was born and raised in Mexico City and is a commentator at the Instituto Mexicano de la Radio in Mexico. We have Dr. Alan Mendoza, who's a co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, Britain's leading think tank fighting for the principles and alliances which keep society free. We have David Revcolevschi, who's a lay leader in French Jewish community. He's a board member and former treasurer of the Paris, you need to help me with this because my French is not great. Consistoire, the largest French organization responsible for Jewish worship, congregations, and kashrut. And also a board member of the Fonds Social Juif Unifi.
Just like the Jewish Federations, the United States.
Right. So yes, the French Jewish umbrella organization responsible for social welfare, culture, and education. And we have as moderator, we have Dr. Gary Rayant, who serves on the Tel Aviv University International Board of Directors, the APAC National Council, and holds various other board positions. During his free times, he's a dental specialist in periodontics and implant dentistry, and also is a co-founder and partner in Dear Doctor Magazine, Inc. So I invite you to read more about our distinguished speakers and the conference app, and thank you for each of our distinguished guests for being here today. So Gary, I'm handing it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Idan. I'm very pleased to be here and to welcome our very distinguished panel. I hope that the size of the room and the audience is not emblematic of what people think of other communities outside of North America. Because if you consider the world population of Jews, 15 or 16 million, there are about 6 in the United States, 6 or 7 in Israel, and about 4 million making up the rest of the world in very diverse and very important communities that have different needs, different issues, and clearly their relationship with Israel and world Jewry is just as important as the United States-Israel connection. As you can tell from my accent, I'm originally from Philadelphia. Philadelphia was actually my first stop in the United States. I'm from Britain. I still subscribe to the motto, dress British, think Yiddish. It seems to work. But that is also emblematic of Jewry today. If any of you have been following the Parshiot of the last 4 or 5 weeks, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all born in one place and all moved to another place. And Joseph particularly was imprisoned in a place and grew to be famous, popular, and a savior of the Jewish people by adapting, by taking on the personalities and the enculturation of the times. And I think that has been emblematic of Jews and is what has helped us survive through the ages. Before we start and I open my questions to the panelists, I'd just like to take a little poll here. How many are American Jews here? Israel? Dare I say other? Well, so I am extremely pleased to have Alan, Lisa, and David here because they fulfill extremely important roles in their own communities. And what I'd like to ask them to do is talk a little bit about themselves, to answer the question, to give a thumbnail sketch of the flavor of the Jewish communities in which they live, to talk about the relationship of their Jewish communities to the countries in which they live, and to talk about their communities' issues and relationships with Israel. So I'm going to ask them to talk for about 10 minutes each. It's a big role to talk about, and then we'll have some questions. So Alan, would you like to kick the ball off?
That's very kind, Gary, and it's good of all of you to be here and to participate in this sort of international odyssey. We're taking you out of Palo Alto for a moment, jumping across the Atlantic in our case. You'll go a bit south for Lisa in a moment. And I think it's... Well, first, let me just ask, who has been to Britain? Who's been to Britain? All right, so brilliant. Look at that. And when you were in Britain, did any of you engage with anything Jewish in Britain? Anything at all? Okay, so a good number of you have done something that have indicated the either a bit of history of Jews in England or something like that. Good, because actually the British Jewish community is a very well-established one, very old, and very well organised actually, but on very different lines, I think, to the American Jewish community. And the history, if you like, in modern times, I say modern in a loose word, starts back in the 17th century when Jews sort of resettled back in the UK. Having been expelled in 1290, we then had a long period of illicit, illegal sort of presence, but they return in 1656 from Holland essentially. And in fact, you'll note my surname Mendoza. Okay, so this is not a normal, sort of Jewish surname, but it is a Judeo-Spanish surname. And in fact, my ancestors came to England in the 17th century, and they actually came directly from Spain, having been hidden Jews, and turned up in London. And in fact, the first community was a Sephardic, Spanish and Portuguese community, which was then joined later by Ashkenazic communities. But already by the 18th century, the Jews were organised in a way where they had their own communal institutions, but they were also starting to have contact with the government and with the powers that be. And a custom developed that when a monarch was crowned, that the Jewish community would present the monarch with a present as a sort of symbol of saying, "Hi, we're here," and essentially, "Don't kick us out again." But that actually led in the 18th century to the development of the first representative organisation, which still exists today. It's now called the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and it's been around, as you can see, for a heck of a long time, longer than the USA has been in existence. We've had a representative Jewish body. And of course, unlike many of the continental Jewish communities, there was no disruption in British Jewish community life, since we returned in the 17th century. We didn't have, thankfully, any Nazi occupation, and so therefore you've had a history of freedom to practice, develop, and go forth in that way. The current population is about 280,000, 300,000, depending on how you count it. It sort of developed in numbers largely in the late 19th century when people, mistaking Britain for America, stopped off from Poland, Ukraine and Russia and never got back on their ships the other way, and so you had a large influx. And it is diverse, of course, in terms of its religious viewpoints. You have every strand of sort of Jewish belief that is there. But what is quite interesting is that nominally, at least, the bulk of the community affiliates to Orthodox Judaism, even though in practice it would be conservative or reform in US terms. But for historic reasons, which we can go into if you really want to, they stuck with the Orthodox synagogues and were members of Orthodox synagogues, which is why, actually, when many British Jews come to America, they don't join Orthodox community, they join conservative or reform communities, because that reflects more their modality of religion as opposed to necessarily what they do in practice. Now, of course, communities also had a very interesting relationship with Zionism, because what would modern Zionism be without Britain and the British element of it? Because just last year we were celebrating, were we not, the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, the document that essentially suggested there would be a Jewish homeland in Israel. And who was to grant that? Well, it was the British. Why the British? Because the British had, of course, conquered Palestine in the First World War, and it was obvious the British would be administering it after that period in time. But there was a history even before that. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, was, of course, based up in Manchester and campaigned for many years for Zionism in Britain. And Weizmann's sort of political contacts included, of course, people like David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, of course, and many others. And, of course, he was an award-winning chemist who had helped develop a technique in the First World War to help Allied munitions. So he had, if you like, a lot of sway in British circles. The other thing which is interesting about Britain is, and we haven't discussed this in a conference on Zionism quite interestingly, about Christian Zionism. Britain was the home of Christian Zionists. In fact, one of the many reasons why there was so much support for the Balfour Declaration, and Balfour himself was a Christian Zionist, was because there was this swathe of British Christians who believed very much in the return of Jews to Zion, and that reflected their own religious beliefs. Now, you can see echoes of that today, of course, in evangelical Christianity here in America. And there were certainly those parallels. If you look at the Christianity, say, of Lloyd George, someone like that, very different to traditional Church of England Christianity. And of course, it had a great impact in terms of how that related. And then, of course, while Britain hardly covered itself in glory in the Mandate period, particularly in the 1930s, nonetheless, the pressures remained within British Zionism to push for a Jewish state in Israel. However, you also saw the divide very clearly in Britain, because who were the people who were most against a Jewish homeland in Palestine? But British Jews serving in the cabinet of the day. So Edwin Montagu, for example, a very famous cabinet minister, led the opposition to the Balfour Declaration within the British cabinet, on the grounds that as a British Jew, he did not want his Britishness diminished by the idea of a Jewish state being created in Palestine. He said it would regard us as being second-class citizens of Britain. So there's always been this tension, I think, within the community in Britain about pro and anti-Zionism, as has been reflected in many other countries as well, but which has had a sort of bearing on the history, if you like, of the Jewish state and its development. And again, fast forward to today, and you've still got those divides. You've got a whole raft of opinion. Broadly speaking, British Jewry is very pro-Zionist. And in fact, I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that we are, per capita, the largest Aliyah contributors in Europe, certainly. It may be different now in the last couple of years since what's happened in France, but I'm sure David can talk about the uniqueness of what happened in France. But for a long time, Britain was a mainstay, and you'll go all across Israel and discover Anglos living in different parts of Israel, obviously. And so the relationship is very strong there. There's youth movements like B'nai Akiva, Federation of Zionist Youth, BBY, lots and lots of youth movements who obviously kind of help develop ideas about Israel within the community. But in recent years, it is true to say that just as in America there's become a disconnect between generations, I think it's fair to say that there's a disconnect between generations in Britain as well. And I think that reflects, in our case, arguments about how Israel is presented, how it presents itself, discussions about what Israel we're talking about. Those are live questions within the British Jewish community today. And so at the very extreme end, you do get splinters, people who come off the end like Jews for Justice for Palestinians, or Jewish Voice for Labour, or Labour Voice, whatever it is called in that kind of context, who do play very much the anti-Zionist card and suggest that they are very against any Zionistic movement or whatever form of Israel they talk about. It is not the form of Israel that we might recognise in this room. So the challenge, I think, in Britain is that you've got this well-established community that has, of course, had a long relationship with Israel that is still struggling to come to terms with the Israel of today rather than the Israel, say, of 50, 60 years ago. And that is a challenge for, obviously, British Jews to look at and develop. It's also a challenge for Israel to look at, because Britain remains a very important country internationally. You've got a permanent seat on the United Nations. You've got, obviously, huge diplomatic heft. We've got our relationship with the USA in terms of being a close ally to you as well here. And if you find a British Jewish community that is no longer, say, supporting Israel in the way it used to do, that cannot but have an impact on Britain-Israel relations and how Israel itself will focus on going forwards. So for us, it's a very, I think, a live issue and a very interesting one about how we can develop a changing form of education about Israel and how this relates to being British, being Jewish, and the connections between those areas. So that should give you a potted history of how that works, and hopefully will give some thought about some of the challenges ahead, which I'm sure we'll address in questions.
I don't want you to be bashful. I do want you to talk a little bit about the unique role, I think, that the Henry Jackson Society is playing.
Well, that's very kind. But I should start by saying the Henry Jackson Society is not a Jewish organisation and has no relationship with the Jewish community. Now, I personally may be Jewish, and I personally may have a connection with the community, but our role is very much, and in fact, almost all of our staff are not Jewish, and our trustees are not Jewish. So this whole connection is not about a Jewish organisation and speaking about Israel, but actually a non-Jewish British organisation that's come round to the viewpoint that there is an importance in Britain supporting Israel from a values and strategic perspective. So what we do is look at the Israel question or other questions in the Middle East or questions of terrorism or of demography that are of interest to Jews and apply them not through a Jewish prism but through a British prism. Is it good for Britain is a question we ask ourselves, not is it good for the Jews. Now, it so happens that in this particular case, what is good for the Jews happens to be what is good for Britain as well. But I think the case that we make in the British Parliament or in the media is strengthened by not coming from a Jewish viewpoint in that regard, but being able to point out to the strategic reasons why Britain should be supportive of a fellow democracy, of a country with similar values to its own, and which faces similar challenges in the forms of things like terrorism that sadly we in Britain have also come to recognise on a regular basis. So that I think is the connectivity between the two there on that side.
And before we go on to Lisa, could you answer one more question, which has to do with the current politics in England? Two things come to mind: Brexit, which I think is on everybody's mind, and also the role of the Labour government and their leader.
Well, thankfully not the Labour government in that context, but the opposition at this moment in time.
Sorry.
So,
I meant the
and I
opposition.
say thankfully not for a party political point of view, but because we'll deal with the Jeremy Corbyn question first. There is no question that the upsurge in anti-Semitism that you've seen in British political circles has largely emanated from this rise of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And which hasn't been dealt with. You've had a case now for the last 2 years when you've had case after case coming forward of elected politicians, people running for office in the Labour Party, ordinary Labour Party members, literally spreading extraordinary anti-Semitic stories, ranging from the blood libel, literally. There was a case maybe a couple of months ago where a Labour, I think it was a councillor, was posting blood libel things on Facebook. I mean, extraordinary. To, the ridiculous, rantings of Ken Livingstone in terms of Hitler was a Zionist, that sort of question, and everything in between, where you've had all sorts of other discussions. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn himself is not immune to this, given his own past associations. A man who calls Hamas and Hezbollah his friends obviously has lots of skeletons in his own closet about his relationship with Israel or with Jews and what he thinks about these people. He himself says he's not an anti-Semite, but I believe actually if you look at his worldview, it is predisposed in the form of ideological conspiracy theories in which Jews feature very largely as capitalists, as oppressors, and this sort of line. So while he would say he's not one, his worldview surely encourages him to act like one, even if he isn't in that sense. And he has not got hold. And when Jewish Labour MPs are standing out there calling him an anti-Semite, you have to, and nothing happens as a result. You have to go, well, if the cap fits, then you've got to wear it in that respect. So there's a great concern that there is a political party in Britain, a mainstream political party, whose leader has at the very least flirted with this, if not actively sort of brought this upon itself. And the fear would, of course, be that if you had a Corbyn government, that would institutionalise anti-Semitism even further, even though I must add an important caveat, there are lots of very good members of the Labour Party who, of course, oppose this aspect in particular and have made a point of fighting very hard against what they think has happened to their party on this score. When it comes to Brexit, it's not particularly an issue, I don't think, for British Jews, but it is, of course, one that could cause huge waves for the country, depending on what kind of Brexit we have. I can't tell you what kind of Brexit we have, because nobody knows, least of all our Prime Minister. But what I can tell you is that it is the most extraordinary case that 2.5 years after an issue has been brought up, if you like, in the form of referendum, all options are still open on the table. That doesn't happen normally, that you still have no idea whether you're actually going to go anywhere out from a no-deal Brexit to a stay in Europe completely game, and we don't know the answer to it. But what it does cause is uncertainty in politics. And when there's uncertainty, there is always a danger that, and when the answer comes out the other end, there's always a danger that it will upset a large number of people who then who may appeal or get appealed to by the extremes. And if you have that extreme, to give you an example today, there is a march being run by a gentleman called Tommy Robinson, who some of you may know because he's created some stir in the US, because some people in the US have decided that he's a real freedom fighter. He's a sort of a guy who ran a street thug movement called the English Defence League, got jailed a few times. He's now being brought into mainstream politics. And as a result of this, you're getting, if you like, links with the far right coming to the fore, as well as the far left, both of whom do not share a particular love for Jews. So there is this whole fear that the extremes are gaining hold, and that you see this in France as well, of course, with the extremes also gaining hold, and that having an impact on sort of diaspora communities in the places where the extremes are getting hold.
Thank you. Wonderful summary. So, sandwiched between Britain and France, we have Lisa from Mexico. So, we'd love to hear a little bit about you, your background, the situation with Mexican Jewry, as you now straddle, I believe, California and Mexico.
Yes, well, neighbors, and it's an honor to be here for the Z3 conference. And I'm very honored to share this panel with my distinguished colleagues from the lost tribes of the diaspora. And I'm happy that we have this opportunity to share some ideas. And well, I want to begin with some statistics about Mexico and its Jewish community. Mexico has 125 million people. We are about 10 million Mexicans living in the United States among you. And out of this, these 125 million, the Jewish community is only between 40,000 and 50,000 people, mostly concentrated in Mexico City. And it's a community that's been around since the first Spaniards came to conquer Mexico in the 16th century. Among the people of Hernán Cortés, there were some conversos, some people that were forced to convert to Catholicism. Some of them practiced Judaism in the New Spain. That was the name of Mexico. And some did practice Judaism in the first years of all the violence in the New Spain. They were able to manage to practice Judaism, but once the New Spain was institutionalized, they brought with them the Inquisition. So that was the end of that community. Although some important Jewish communities were established throughout Mexico, and the story of the people that settled in the northern city of Monterrey. I don't know if you're familiar with Monterrey. It's in the north of Mexico, and it's very known for its industriousness. It's a city that's in a very, not exactly the desert, but the environment is hostile. And 75% of the people that created this amazing industrial city are the descendants from these conversos. These were Portuguese and Spanish conversos. It took a couple of centuries until the Jewish community would start to renew itself. Mexico became independent from Spain in 1810 to 1820. And in the 1860s, we had a president, Benito Juárez, who declared the freedom of cult for all Mexicans, and that included Jews. And we had an Austrian emperor for a while, 1870, Maximilian from Prussia. He declared also the freedom of cult, and with him there came many Austro-Hungarian Jews and French Jews who started to arrive to Mexico. But the greatest influx of Jews came after the Mexican Revolution was finished in about 1920, and this was a wave of Jews from Russia and from Lithuania that were suffering from the pogroms. They found an open country in Mexico. Also in the 1930s with Plutarco Elías Calles, he was very open to migration during the war as well. And so what the situation is now, so as I mentioned before, about 50,000 Jews. There are three main communities, and they're very fragmented. So you have the Sephardic community, you have the Ashkenazi, and you have the Levantine Jews. And they each worship in their own synagogues, and they have their own schools. In terms of religiosity.
Syrians, when you say Levantine.
Syrians, yes. Well, Greater Syria, no?
That's right.
Yes, what was considered the Greater Syria, Iran, Syria, part of Iraq. So, in terms of religiosity, it's divided mostly in conservative and Orthodox. We don't have the Reform movement in Mexico. It's a very tight community. There is very little intermarriage. About 95% of Jews in Mexico marry other Jews. About 90% of Jewish children attend Jewish schools, and here are two examples. These two are my kids over here. They went to a Jewish Montessori school that actually was intercommunitary. So you had people from all the different communities in Mexico City attending this wonderful little school. What else? Well, Mexico, the Mexican government has always been very open and very friendly towards Jews. Jews are a complete and integral part of Mexican society. They're not seen as something separate. We consider ourselves as Mexican Jews fully, and you can see it if you go to any Mexican household on Passover. You may be served gefilte fish with jalapeno chilies in it. And that's very normal. And there are always Mexican salsas in any Jewish household. So, this is more of the story of the resilience and the adaptation of the Jewish people wherever they are. Mexico is no exception. There are so many Jewish chefs that have incorporated the laws of kashrut, or maybe not necessarily, with the fresh and delicious ingredients of Mexico, no? and pungent tastes and everything. So, well, cooking is one of my passions. So, I won't distract myself from the main topic. How many of you know that Frida Kahlo's dad was Jewish? Yes. He was Jewish from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He migrated to Mexico, and he was actually one of the main photographers for President Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz was later, well, he was president between 1880 and 1910. He loved to stay in power. First, he was a revolutionary, and then he decided to stay for 30 years. Then he was toppled by the revolutionaries. But he was the photographer of the regime. So he was pretty well connected. And well, Frida Kahlo is very emblematic of Mexico. She was a Mexican feminist, a Mexican radical, and she was very good friends with Trotsky and other Russian Jews that were socialists and communists who established in Mexico in the 1930s. So there's one cultural icon. And there are a lot of Mexican leaders in government positions that are openly Jewish. So it's not an issue. A couple of administrations ago, we had a very prominent doctor who was heading the Ministry of Health, for example. And Jews are prominent in business, intellectuals, in the arts. And I could generally say that when we don't have the anti-Semitism problem that we traditionally see in the rest of the world, especially in Europe, it's not that kind of a problem at all, fortunately. Where we could see anti-Semitism, but I don't know if we should call it that exactly. I'm still debating it. Is the Mexican media doesn't usually paint Israel in a favorable light, And there are a few reasons for it. The first one is that Mexico's history as being ruled by a colonial country, as a country that had been exploited, as a country that had been a colony for 300 years and an emerging country for so long, tends to identify with the underdog. It doesn't matter when. So when Israel became a nation, well, a country, a state, Mexico didn't recognize it immediately, but it did in 1950, create a relationship, and by 1952, we already had strong diplomatic ties that have grown since. So this is the reason of the underdog. And another reason is that there are not many foreign correspondents from Mexican media outlets out in the world, including Israel. So where do our journalists get the information from? From international media outlets that are in Israel, and they're usually from Europe. So, we could be talking about from Spain, for example, from Italian sources, French sources, and they don't usually tend to favor Israel. And in this respect, the Jewish Central Committee has within the committee, there's a group called Tribuna Israelita that monitors the press, how the press deals with anything that has to do with Israel, with the Jewish communities, and they do a lot of work to educate the media. So let's say there's an attack, in the West Bank, and there are many civilian casualties on the side of the Palestinians. And we don't necessarily get both sides of the story. Were they human shields? So this is something that the Mexican media has to look at as well, and that's part of the effort that they're doing. The Jewish Central Committee in Mexico has been around since the 1940s. So, and its job is to establish relationships with the Mexican government and also with other faiths. So the relationship has been very good. Mexican presidents have visited Israel in 3 times. The first one was in 1975. But Israeli prime ministers have only visited Mexico, a standing prime minister, once. And that was Netanyahu in 2017, and perhaps not for the best reasons of all. So I want, and I'll explain. The relationship with Mexico has always been very good, and except for one incident. Prime Minister Netanyahu, right after Trump declared that he was going to build a wall with Mexico, came out with an unfortunate tweet saying, "President Trump is right. I built a wall along Israel's southern border. It stopped all illegal immigration. Great success, great idea." He sounds like Trump. This was not well taken by the Mexican government or by the Jewish Central Committee at all. So on the day that this tweet came out on a Shabbat. So the Jewish Central Committee does not work on Shabbat. But they immediately came out with a press declaration saying that they distanced themselves from Netanyahu's commentary, and that they continue to back the Mexican president in its relations with the United States. Nothing had ever happened. Nothing like this had ever happened in the bilateral relations. And the Mexican government quickly said that it was disappointed by the comment and hurt, because our countries are good friends. to the extent that President Rivlin of Israel had to call the Mexican president and say, let's leave the crisis behind, let's move forward, we are good friends, sorry for the misunderstanding. So in the world of diplomacy, there are ways to say I'm sorry without putting yourself completely out there. This was one example. So, in summary, what I want to say also, well, I didn't mention that the Mexican community, even though it's small, it's very pro-Israel. It makes important contributions to Israel in many ways, cultural, economic, etc. It is a similar situation with other Jewish communities throughout Latin America, that they're very supportive and very, very vocal and very involved. And I think we have to include the other diasporas in this conversation that's going on now, especially in a world that's changing so rapidly in this 21st century, where the new alliances in the world are being redefined. The foes of yesterday aren't necessarily them, and the friends aren't either. There's a reconfiguration of world power. Latin America has a large population. It has large resources. It has strong Jewish communities in every country. And Israel should be making a greater effort to engage and not wait until 2017 for a prime minister to make a visit to several Latin American countries, including Mexico. And Mexico is important in many ways in the international sphere. One, as a leader in the non-aligned nations, which is this movement created in the 70s of the middle and poor countries, as a response to being overwhelmed by the larger countries. It's a medium-sized economy. It is quite respected around the world, even though us in Mexico, having the United States next to us, we're always doubting about our capabilities. But actually, if you see it in the world order, it's the 14th economy with a strong, vocal Jewish community. So there has to be we have to get closer, and I hope that we can talk about bringing the Z1 to some Latin American capital in the next year, and start to invite other diasporas. The ones a country that occurs to me, South Africa. The South African Jewish community is so important. So those are some of my comments.
Thank you. All-encompassing, very nice introduction on Mexican Jewry. And we'll come back to that last question you asked, which will be one of my first to the panel. So with that, David, please give us an overview of yourself and France.
Okay. So good afternoon. I'm David Revcolevschi. I'm a lawyer in Paris, a French lawyer in an American law firm in Paris. And as was said before, I'm involved in various Jewish organizations. The religious side, social, education. I'm also the president of the Hillel local branch of Hillel International, and also the vice president of the European Council of Jewish Communities. And I will go back to that. I'd like to start, first of all, with the title of our session, Global Diaspora and Contemporary Zionism, and go back to what Yossi Beilin said earlier today. And he said, we talk about global diaspora, but we should stop talking about that, because in reality, the U.S. and Israel together represent 87% of the discussion. And so, we should be blunt and clear about that and should have this dialogue. So in that context, what is the role of our respected diasporas? And on the back of it, I'd like to mention another discussion I had yesterday regarding French Jewry. And the difference between the Anglo Jewry and the French Jewry is that we don't speak English, obviously. and that makes a big difference. Yes. And so I asked several people in the assistance, actually, to participant of the conference. I said to Israeli representative and American people, I said, how many people do you think there are in the French Jewish communities? So there was a discussion, And consensus was, from 50 to 100,000. Okay, that was, the numbers that came from there. And so the real number is actually is more than 500,000. And it was really striking to see that this reality, is not known by, a large part of the population, in the world. And in particular, you mentioned, the total numbers of the global Jewry. That means that, in fact, we are representing, from 4 to 5%, of the global Jewry in the world today. But the reality is that we're not really present, and I will explain why. And maybe another reason for being interested in what's happening in our communities in general, and not only the French one, is that if indeed there is a dialogue, which is the strategic dialogue between Israel and the United States, and if we want this dialogue to be democratic, then a democracy is characterized by the way you treat minorities, right? And so being those minorities and taking into account what we have to say in this discussion is pretty important. So going back now to the French Jewish community, and before going back to history, I'll just state a few facts about where we are today. So as I said, around 500,000 Jews, probably around 1 million people eligible for the law of return in France, which is a pretty large number. We represent roughly, a little less than 1% of the population, 0.8%. And interestingly, this number is exactly the number we were in 1306, when the Jews were expelled from France. That was the first big expulsion, and then there was another one just in the 14th century. And some Jews always stayed in France and then came back after the 18th century. The other big secret of the Jewish people is that probably 70% of the people in this room have ancestors coming from France. Because most of the Jews that actually went to Eastern Europe, whether they were expelled from England at some point, from Spain, or because it was the center of Europe, actually went through Europe. And if you take a region like Normandy, which some of you knew, in Normandy, in the 13th century, there were around Normandy alone, 200 Jewish locations, in Normandy. So this was really a real presence. Then historically, what happened is after the French Revolution, some German Jews and Eastern European Jews, came to France, and which brought the number before the Second World War around 300,000 Jews, and then in the 60s, the Jews from North Africa and Egypt, after they were expelled from their respective countries, came to France, and this meant an additional 250,000 Jews that joined France. Some of them were already French because Algeria was a colony of France, and which meant that at the beginning of the 70s, there were around 600,000 Jews in France. Then what's the current situation, and to what extent is it important to bridge and to create bonds between the French Jewry and the international Jewry? The French Jewry today faces challenges in a paradoxical situation. I mentioned, this 500,000 people. The community has never been as lively as it is today. There's a very strong cultural life. We have around 500 Jewish communities, congregations, synagogues. We've got the famous kosher restaurant exception. In Paris alone, you have today around 350 kosher restaurants in the suburbs, which is a larger number than New York and probably of Tel Aviv in terms of kosher restaurants.
Probably all of Israel.
Right. And altogether, I think we've got around 420 all over France. Another important factor is that Paris alone is the fourth largest Jewish city outside of Israel, after New York, Los Angeles, and South Florida. And this is pretty important because it means that in a world where influence, is based on large towns and not only in countries, right? It means that with 350,000 Jews in Paris and the suburbs, that means that this is a pretty influential place, but still not speaking very good English and not very well connected with the outer world. So thriving community with also some specifics. One of them is that it has a very, and this is unique in the world, it has a very strong Sephardi community. Today, roughly 60% of the population, of the Jewish population, is Sephardi and 40% Ashkenazi, but within the organized community, i.e. schools, synagogues, the active community, it's probably 80% Sephardi and 20% Ashkenazi. And in my kids' school, they would be around 90% Sephardi and 10% Ashkenazi. So, and it has some uniqueness because in the way the Sephardi communities would relate to religion would be different. And also one of the big differences is that in the 30s, when Ashkenazi Jews moved to France, the affiliations were very much ideological, i.e. you were a Zionist, you were a Bundist, you were a communist, you were a socialist, and you belonged to a group of people, and as an immigrant, you joined the Jewish community, but you would join those groups. In the 60s, when the Jews came from North Africa, the mode of affiliation was different. The ideologies were down, and so you would, and also because of their experience in North Africa, they would be closer to the synagogues and to the religion. And so one of the critical things for us is there has been that type of affiliation to the communities which gave incredible results. You know, I mentioned the kosher restaurant exception, but in 1960, there were 5 kosher restaurants in Paris, 2 butchers, right? There are now 80. So you need to realize that it has been tremendous change. But this is very challenging because the Jews that came from Eastern Europe were affiliated to those organizations, and some of them, if not many of them, assimilated. This was their way to integrate. The way to integrate for the Sephardic community that came to France was more through the synagogues and religion. But this is a way to integrate. When you're an immigrant, you know, you need structures to be integrated. And so the big question for us is how do we build so that, you know, 3rd generation and 4th generation, you know, remain really in the community. So this is the thriving part. Now we obviously have challenges, and you often hear about it. And it's interesting. I read today in the news there was in the meeting of the Israeli cabinet. And Netanyahu officially asked Bennett, which is making some fuss, to actually establish a big plan now for the French Aliyah. And it's always bizarre that, you know, they take these decisions just, you know, a day after the riots that have taken place in France. But let's go to the challenges of the French Jewry and the French society. We've got 2 sorts of challenges. I'm not talking about the internal challenges that all of our communities have, you know, assimilation, intermarriage, but more the external challenges. And so the external challenges are first, obviously, radical Islam, with a Muslim community that is today around 7 to 8% of the population, which has some issues with it, with integration of the French society, and at the margin, a sizable portion of people with radical Islam, and so we obviously had, you know, the killings, the series of killings, which unfortunately, you know, inaugurated a cycle that we've seen elsewhere. And so we had, you know, a killing in 2006, and then in 2012 we had the killings in the school in Toulouse. And then we had another killing in 2015, but then something very strange happened, which was that the French society was hit as a whole. So when the Jews were first the targets, right, it created a very strong sense of panic, you know, among the French Jewish communities, or at least some of them. And that explains why you had a surge in the Aliyah. And the surge in the Aliyah was usually, it takes 2 to 3 years for people to realize and take the decision to go. So, with the killings in 2012, then, in 2014 was really the big surge. Usually the French have been to Israel, they were around 1,500 every year, close to the American number. Or 2,000, and suddenly, it went to 3.5, and then it went to 7,000 a year. And so it means that if you take the last, since the establishment of the State of Israel, from the establishment of the State of Israel to 2012, there were around 55,000 Jews that moved from France to Israel. And from 2012 to today, there were around 40,000. So that's a big difference, but also what is interesting is, so the number was, 3,005, 7, then 5, then 3.5, and now it's back to 2.5. One of the reasons is that because the French society was targeted as a whole, with the Bataclan and with the Nice, killings, means that suddenly the Jews felt they were part of the national story, i.e., we were targeted by radical Islam, but not anymore alone. So, and the French government reacted very strongly, when there were the killings. So it's on a way it's impressive, but on the other way it's reassuring. We had in my kids' school for a year, we had a platoon of 8 soldiers, day and night, full gear. And so that was kind of impressive, but then it led to some interesting stories with, platoon commanders complaining about, their soldiers being fed with too many croissants by the Jewish mothers. And actually there were, chains of emails, who was responsible for bringing the cakes and the croissant. But after a year, the problem became so national that we had to give, the presence was required elsewhere, so we had to deal with that differently. So we have those challenges, but we have another challenge, which is also populism, and what's happening, and at the last election when President Macron was elected. The 2 next candidates, or almost at least one, was Marine Le Pen, the extreme right wing, and the extreme right left guy, who was very anti-Zionist and quite extremist. He's more leftist than Corbyn. He's really on the left, and so they were very close, and there were really anxiety before the presidential election, and to be true as well. What happened yesterday and a few weeks before, with this kind of movement that no one knows how to really, people don't really know what this means. The yellow, I don't know if you've read about that, but the yellow vest, but it resonates with what's happening in other countries in Europe, in Italy, in Spain, where you have, this very strange reunification of extreme forces from the right and the left. And, Brexit is another, it's a different story, but it has also something to do with it. And so there is anxiety. Within that context, it is, to me, absolutely crucial that the French Jewry creates stronger bonds with other juries in the world. Because in dire times, in tough times, we need more leadership. We need to exchange ideas. We need to get the best experiences. And this cannot be only done through the Israeli-diaspora relationship. It also has to be done through a better collaboration and sharing between the various large communities. So in a way, when you look at the 3 of us, I think we've got a pretty good expression of the current diaspora and the challenges. On the one hand, Alan, you're the English speaking. Being English speaking means that you have a group, that's my analysis, which gathers England, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, tiny community, right, and the United States. And you're part, in a way, of the same group, i.e. you've got your own differences, but there are 2 Jewish languages today, English and Hebrew, right? So you're part of the English, English group. So ideas flows. Jonathan Sachs is one of your heroes, like he's in England. It can flow. If you're a rabbi in England, you can be a rabbi in South Africa, or you can move and find a job in a U.S. community. So ideas flows, right? Then, Lisa, this is the example of a smaller community with its own challenges. And we've had many of them in Europe. Italian community, 30,000 people. Dutch community, 30,000 people. Hungarian community, 15,000 people. Slightly bigger Germany, 120,000 people. So for each of those communities have their respective challenges, but they need to be better integrated. They need to be better related and linked to the Jewish world and the state of Israel. And this is something I think we'll need to work on. And this is our responsibility, as French Jewish leaders, to work on that, to strengthen this relationship. But I think this is really a shared responsibility.
Thank you. Before we leave you, to open the panel to questions, can you talk a little bit more about the relationship of France and Israel, perhaps within the context of Europe, because clearly none of those countries have the same depth of relationship that the United States does.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the issues with the French government is it has always championed, multilateralism, right? Which is something which is not very trendy these days, right? And I cannot say that, France historically had a strong interest in the Arab world, where the Arab world was, the French colonies. And which doesn't have, it still has some influence, in that area. So it's true that it has historically been very strong in defending, the right for two states, and a very neutral, if not biased position, towards the interest of the Arab world. But I would say that currently, the current president has a very pragmatic approach to the conflict, i.e., not spend times with the discussions that may make people unhappy, but try really to be on the ground to find realistic solutions. And talking about BDS, for instance, France, and this has been a strong point for the Jewish community, has adopted, I think was one of the first adopter of an anti-BDS law, which actually forbids any boycott, of Israeli products or companies. So I would say, in short, still neutral position, quite pragmatic. And, I was at an ELNET conference 2 months ago in Paris. And to summarize,
I'm not sure what
ELNET is, is kind of the APAC for, other places in the world to just try to replicate what APAC does in the United States and other jurisdictions. And there was a big conference, and at some point, there was a consensus between several big shots of the Israeli government and various army and intelligence services and some of the American presence there, which was to say, in a way, there is a strong consensus, including with the French government, about the key issues today. Consensus being, threat of Iran, the situation in Syria, very strong consensus. There's one area where there's also a very strong consensus, which is the presence of Israel in the territory, right? Which a consensus where people would say that this is, under international relations, an abnormal situation of such a long period of time, but which would just, but on the core issue and the key present issues, which are really where people identify the threats and the current threats, there is real alignment, among the French government and the U.S. government on those issues. but obviously, some differences on the issues of Jerusalem and the Shtachim and the territories.
So thank you all. I'd like to ask one overall general question to all of you. Given the mandate of this conference, how can we include diaspora Jewry outside of North America?
Well, invite them would be the first one. So I'm delighted that we are the international representatives, right? We're here in this. But the reality is, where are the Jews, as was meant, from South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, Germany, etc., Russia, where are they all? They're not here. And if we're serious about having a conversation about Jewish peoplehood, then surely the Jewish people have to be here to be part of this movement and to be part of it. And particularly this concept that's trying to reboot Zionism for the 21st century. Okay, if we're going to reboot it, we have to reflect what is the Jewish world of today and have strong elements of Zionism in all those communities. And it seems to me that it is easy, David mentioned quite rightly, the bail-in comment, well, let's just deal with America and Israel. And you could take that approach. You could say, we're the dominant force, the rest of you don't matter, so on and so forth. But that goes very much against what this conference is about, which is about the Jewish people, not about the Jews of America and the Jews of Israel. So for me, I think the way, and I hope we'll hear something of this in the closing plenary, and the workshop for those who are there tomorrow, will be how do you actually roll this out, not just across denominations and between Israel and the US, but through also to communities that are not represented here today, so that this becomes a truly international movement and one which we can all be part of. So that's sort of my response to that would be, let's get involved. There will be interest, very much interest, because the questions that are being wrestled with here are also very pressing ones for our communities. Maybe more so for ours than your two, but maybe not. Maybe it's interesting to get that approach as well. So that's my thought.
Lisa.
Yes, well, I agree with Alan. I don't have much to add. Of course, an invitation, but also this invitation based on a very pragmatic principle that you can't put all your eggs in one basket. In this changing world, you don't know what the alliances are going to be or what the problems are going to be. So you have to create safety nets all over the world, and you have to create strong relations, and you have to update the discourse on Zionism, not only where most of the Jews live, but throughout the world, because the world is changing, and who knows? Climate change. Climate change is going to bring a lot of movement in the world. So maybe New Zealand ends up being a very good place for the Jews in 80 years. But we have to start thinking about this today because of the great challenges, no? And so that's absolutely pragmatic and necessary.
We didn't talk about this, but you have some background in international relations.
Yes.
How would you pragmatically go about doing what you're talking about? As we say in England, tachlis.
Yes. We'll start with the invitation to dialogue. I'm sure communities all over the world will be very happy to participate. We can start with a conference like this in Latin America, and do the same in every continent, and in a couple of years have a worldwide discussion of this type. Fortunately, the internet allows us to share ideas very quickly, so this shouldn't be this shouldn't take a lot of time. But these are matters that we have to start talking about, no? With all the movement of people, displaced people that are going to be happening, and we're not going to be immune to that. If the Jewish people want to thrive, we have to thrive all over the world. I was just in a panel. It was about a Jewish doing tikkun olam in the world, no, as Jews. And one of the questions was, how many of you think Jews will be among the first settlers of Mars? And everybody raised their hand. So, before we think about Mars, we can start thinking about, the movement of the Jewish people in the century to come.
David.
Our responsibility is actually to proactively contribute to the discussion. I'll say how. I didn't mention that, but we need to look at ourselves, we the smaller communities, right, and see what our strength and what we think we can bring to the discussion. And just to give you a few examples, if I look back to the French Jewish community, we're a very united community, unlike many others. We share the similar structure where 95% of the Jewish community is Orthodox. I mean, the synagogues are Orthodox, but sociologically people are diverse. But this is an example of unity. The other one is Sephardi Ashkenazi. I mean, seamless. In most of the world, you take, Mexico and many other places, you've got communities, with Sephardi communities, and even in the United States, Syrians, Iranians, you've got these divisions, not to talk about the various denominations. In France, in the synagogues, well, you could argue that many became Sephardi, but seamless, there's an issue. The relations with the state, the notion of, particularism and universalism, how they match together, all these are experiences that we can share, and we can also, proudly share with the American Jewry, with Israel, which is a country with a lot of tribes. And so, and right now, for instance, you have a slightly, larger number of French people now in Israel. And for instance, a few weeks ago, there were the first elections, of the town halls where actually the French started to want to behave like a tribe a little bit and to bring their spirit. And I can tell you, many Israelis tell us, we're really surprised. We see those French guys coming. They go to the synagogue in the morning, and then they go watch television in the afternoon, and then they go to the football game, and they go to the beach, and they go to the restaurants, but they need to be kosher. So they're bringing, another way also to look at things. And then, I heard earlier in one of the sessions, especially in California, that you shouldn't say that you have a plan, but you have a dream, right? So I think more than a dream, there are very practical ways to deal with that. One of this is really to favor, but this is an issue to you because this already exists, sending people, to the various communities. I do believe that rabbis are still important, as leaders, and that, we'd better have them like, who's very successful today in the world? Groups like Chabad, who actually have, they do it every day. They have a network. Their people are going everywhere in the world, taking experiences, meeting the people, recreating Jewish life in forgotten communities. And they do that because they're united. And even when I look in our tiny, because we have tiny Reformed and Masorti and conservative synagogues in France, they're very also creative and very successful, although small numbers, because they're part of a huge network. So we have to replicate that. So sending people, creating youth camps where actually people share, go to the various countries, and we need to multiply and increase those very simple initiatives so that people meet together. And this is easy today because we're in a globalized world. We have in a world of networks, of social networks, and so this is the distances have shrunk.
I agree with a lot of those tenets, especially given an example like Chabad, who's done such wonderful work around the world. Listen, we've had a wonderful panel, very interesting. We're running just about at the end of our time, but if you're willing to stay for another 5 minutes, maybe we could take a couple of questions from the floor. Yes, sir.
Michael Sosby from Oakland, thank you so much for this. No. Michael Sosby from Oakland, thank you. In the Bay Area, we have an intermarriage rate of 60 to 70%, and it's been that way for a while. I think that's driving a lot of the conversation that we hear, or at least some of the tone here. Lisa, in Mexico, you say that 95% of the Jews marry Jews, 95% send their kids to Jewish day schools. I'm going to ask you, how do you achieve that? What's the secret? And for David, my wife is fluent in French. She loves Paris. Last year, our 30th wedding anniversary, she wouldn't let me take her because she's afraid of anti-Semitism, and she thought I would be in danger because I wear kippah. what should I say to her? Thank you.
Yeah. Lisa?
Well, this is a conversation I had with one of the people from the Jewish Central Committee. And the Jewish community in Mexico is quite isolated from the rest of the population. So they live in certain quarters in Mexico City because they like to, and they send their children to Jewish schools. And while a lower intermarriage rate is favorable, I think the downside is that it's also becoming more isolated, and from the rest of society. So I don't know how that would play in a liberal, open society like California. I think it's very different. Mexican society is also very fragmented. It's very fragmented in social classes. It's very fragmented in different communities. So you have people from Spanish descent and people from German descent, and everybody has their communities, and even the Jews. So don't talk to so and so because they have we're Ashkenazi and they're they're from Aleppo and we don't get together. So it's a very fragmented community. So that has enabled it to remain more in its integrity, but also at the same time it's probably missing out from new ideas and from being more active in general society. I'm not saying that they're completely isolated. Jewish business people, intellectuals, artists have a very large contribution, doctors, etc. But it lives a little bit in a bubble, which would be difficult to replicate in the U.S. and especially in the West Coast.
So regarding your kippah question, yes. So let me reassure you. I mean, you'd have an issue if you wanted to. I'm not sure you would want to go for your vacation in some of the suburbs where you have frictions because of the coexistence of the Jewish population of a Muslim population, or non-coexistence or difficult coexistence. But let's take my example. I'm not wearing kippah during the week. I'm only wearing it on Shabbat when I'm going to shul because I can't carry it. Okay, and I'm living the west side of Paris, in a wealthy neighborhood. Never had any type of issues, and I'm not worried. I'm not concerned, and so it's not like the United States, but it was not before. Even when there were anti-Semitism, because the societies are different. Because people look at, in the French public space, people would not expect you generally to show signs of religiosity. That's the reason why we had the issue with the scarf in schools. Unlike the United Kingdom, where it was accepted differently, although things are changing, I can understand a little bit. So we have this different tradition, unrelated to anti-Semitism. But I wouldn't feel concerned.
One more question. Last question.
I'm from a small community in France, Nancy. And I would say, aside from Paris, Strasbourg, Lyon, and Marseille, all these small communities in France are dying. Should an organization, and a lot of it is happening, I believe, also in small cities in the United States, should an organization like a concept like these three put the fate of those small communities on its agenda?
Well,
I know. It's actually a difficult question that we're facing in many countries in Europe, right? And the question is whether, there is two strategies. One strategy is the Chabad strategy, which is to say, wherever there is a Jewish presence, we need to find a way to maintain a community. And then just the, in France we call it, some people call it l'aliyah intérieure, the internal aliyah, which is, just, you're the extraordinary exception in Mexico. But the question is, when you've got the number of possibilities of Jewish marriage that are shrinking, what is the strategy? And all those communities, mid-sized, small-sized communities, are confronted to the issue. So either you have the Chabad strategy, which is, we don't care, we're sending until the last Jewish man, shaliach there, and otherwise the question is whether, the strategic decisions are made, to strengthen, Jewish life where it is, but truly, as you said, at the detriment of some smaller communities, which is a big issue generally.
Yeah, I would say on that, we've got a similar issue in Britain. The provincial communities are dying out, but the reason for that has got nothing to do with anti-Semitism or something like that. It's down to just economic opportunity.
No, exactly.
And it reflects a history for hundreds of years of people, including Jews, moving. Why did Jews start off in those places? Because there was economic opportunity back at the time. Why did they spread out from all the small towns in America? The same reason. You needed a tailor, a peddler. All these people had economic opportunity. They don't anymore. So I don't think it's the business of Zionism or even Jewish organizations to deal with structural economic issues in our societies. If there are people left behind, they need to be cared for, obviously, that's clear. But that form of care may be different to what you do in the big urban centres now where people have flocked to. So I think we have to accept that society moves on, that things change, and what may have been the norm 100 or 50 years ago has to change to reflect what's going on around us.
So with that, I will thank all of you. Thank you, panel.